esas nieblas de primeras horas en la plana de Vic se aprecian muy bien también en esta imagen que nos envían también desde Barcelona, en donde se aprecian esas estelas de los aviones, debido precisamente a que ya se nota el cambio de tiempo, la humedad va aumentando, el aire frío llega y se empiezan a formar esas estelas.
Queremos acabar con un par de fotografías de estelas de avión. Acostumbran a anunciar un cambio de tiempo. De momento no lo vemos hasta, como decíamos, el viernes, pero estas fotografías realmente muestran esos rastros de las estelas de los aviones. Esta primera fotografía desde Eibar, en Guipúzcoa, con un mar de nubes a la derecha. Ven también esas nubes bajas de primeras horas de la mañana, y el mismo fenómeno desde Madrid. Nos enviaba Isaura i Fernando. I així queremos acabar.
I el canvi l'anuncien els núvols alts que hi havia aquest capvespre. Per tant, doncs, a veure si demà canvia una miqueta el temps. Que tingui molt bé.
Los cirros que se han formado debido al paso de los aviones, las estelas de los aviones. Es un fenómeno bastante normal, en general requiere de condiciones un poco especiales, se necesita que la humedad ambiental en las capas medias de la atmósfera, en las capas altas de la troposfera, sea elevada, además que el viento no sea muy intenso. Entonces, cuando atraviesan los aviones toda esta zona, el mismo vapor que expulsan las turbinas pues favorece precisamente a la condensación de este vapor de agua y se forman todas estas nubes. Si además tenemos humedad en aumento, como mínimo constante, esas nubes no se disipan y además el viento, como decía, con dotes de características débil, tampoco favorece pues a que se vayan deformando. Además, muchas veces cuando tenemos la formación de esas estelas de los aviones y vemos que se mantienen y que esos cirros se extienden a lo largo del día, quiere decir que la humedad relativa incluso va en aumento y muchas veces nos anticipa un cambio de tiempo asociado a la llegada de los sistemas frontales. Y esto es lo que va a ocurrir precisamente de cara a la jornada de mañana. Vamos a observar cuál es la evolución de imágenes del satélite Meteosat, pero ya...
Si se fijan en esta imagen, ampliamos una zona, el norte, justo encima del País Vasco. Fíjense en esas líneas, son estelas de los aviones que se dibujan en medio de esa maraña de nubes altas. Se han visto en muchos puntos del país, nos han llegado fotografía, por supuesto, desde Donostia. Miquel Vega, siempre atento con su cámara a cualquier fenómeno meteorológico. También desde Logroño nos enviaban esas preciosas estelas de avión, 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 esas preciosas estelas de avión.
Vicente Fuentes, buenas noches.
Muy buenas noches, Pedro. Un placer estar en tu programa.
Cuéntanos, por favor, ¿cómo podemos definir exactamente a una chemtrail? ¿En qué consiste dicho fenómeno?
Bien, para definir chemtrail tenemos que definir primero lo que sería un contrail. Un contrail es esa línea que van dejando los aviones a su paso y que no deja de ser vapor de agua condensado en torno a la salida de su combustible a través de los reactores. Bien, pues lo cierto es que los chemtrails se diferencian de esos contrails, de esas líneas que dejan los aviones comerciales, porque resulta que muestran unas características que son diferentes. Por ejemplo, una cosa que realmente es muy visible cuando vemos un chemtrail es que son mucho más grandes que las estelas normales. Tardan varios minutos, incluso horas o días en difuminarse. Y lo cierto es que aparecen a muy diferentes alturas. Incluso se han llegado a dar casos de la aparición de esas chemtrails que tardan tantísimo tiempo en difuminarse por debajo de la barrera de 8.000 metros. Claro, esto a nivel científico es muy interesante porque por debajo de esa barrera de los 8.000 metros la temperatura no dejaría condensarse a ese vapor de agua.
Chemtrail, un término que une dos palabras inglesas y que viene a significar rastro químico. Con ello nos referimos a ciertas estelas que surgen al paso de algunos aviones y que al parecer serían notoriamente diferentes de esas que normalmente conocemos como estelas de condensación. Hoy nos acercamos a este fenómeno a través de las investigaciones del escritor y periodista independiente Miguel Jara.
Soluciones en este este caso yo llamo geoingeniería, a soluciones tecnológicas, que es la geoingeniería, pues una nueva ciencia que lo que promueve es combatir el cambio climático por medios tecnológicos a gran escala planetaria, métodos que por cierto no están nada aprobados porque son muy novedosos y se está haciendo de espaldas a la ciudadanía para alcanzar una temperatura de confort que se dice, es decir, mitigar en la medida el cambio climático.
While controlling the Earth's climate system sounds like science fiction, such proposals are already being hatched out by government agencies, scientists, businesses around the world. Supporters of geoengineering endorse radical ways to manipulate the planet, including creating artificial volcanoes to pollute the atmosphere with sulfur particles. This is environmental scientist David Keith explaining the idea.
This geoengineering idea in its simplest form is basically the following. You could put fine particles, say sulfuric acid particles, sulfates, into the upper atmosphere, the stratosphere, where they'd reflect away sunlight and cool the planet.
Interest linking researchers, venture capitalists, and corporations. We're joined by Clive Hamilton, professor of public ethics at Charles Sturt University in Canberra, Australia. He's the author of Earth Masters, The Dawn of the Age of Climate Engineering. What is climate engineering?
Well, it's a range of schemes that are being developed by scientists, particularly in the US, to essentially try to counter the effects of global warming by technological interventions in the global climate system. They range from the benign, such as making biochar, a kind of charcoal, through to the science fiction, like putting a cloud of mirrors in space to deflect some sunlight, to probably the premier scheme that receives most attention and which, in my view, is very likely to be implemented in perhaps 20, 30 years' time, the one that David Keith mentioned, the idea of essentially installing a solar shield, a layer of sulfate particles around the Earth to deflect a certain proportion of incoming solar radiation. So in other words, to regulate the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth. Schemes to essentially take control of the climate system of planet Earth.
The Heartland Institute describes geoengineering as, quote, much less expensive than seeking to stem temperature rise solely through the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. The Cato Institute argues that, quote, geoengineering is more effective than emissions controls altogether. And the Hudson Institute says geoengineering, quote, could obviate the majority of the need for carbon cuts and enable us to avoid lifestyle changes.
It, in a way, refuses to vindicate the warnings of environmentalists. There's something profoundly wrong in our economic and political system, because geoengineering comes along and says, well, look, the system can solve the problem.
And which are the corporations that are most involved with this?
Well, most corporations are kind of staying at arm's length from all of this, as indeed governments are for the time being. But quietly behind the scenes, you can see them taking interest. There are a number of powerful or wealthy venture capitalists. Bill Gates is the sort of prominent player here who's invested in a range of geoengineering schemes. You can go to the US Patent Office and you'll find Bill Gates' name on a couple of patents for geoengineering. We've also starting to see the oil companies, even Exxon, BP, Shell, starting to take an interest. Who's carried out a couple of experiments here, including one off the coast of British Columbia a couple of months ago, entirely unauthorised and probably illegal, and yet he was up there spreading iron slurry or iron sulfates from the back of his ship, carrying out a geoengineering experiment, which highlights one of the main concerns that many of us have. There's virtually no regulation of geoengineering, and when it comes to sulfate aerosol spraying, there's nothing to prevent a government, any government, or even a corporation or a billionaire with a messiah complex from launching a program of taking control of the Earth's weather by installing this kind of solar shield.
What about the mirrors in the sky?
Well, this is more on the sci-fi end of it, but the idea is to send up a cloud, a large number of small mirrors that would be stationed in a particular spot between the Earth and the Sun. It deflects some of the sunlight so it misses the Earth and heads off into space.
Hatched out by government agencies, scientists, businesses around the world, seeking to stem temperature controls altogether, of the need for carbon cuts and enable us to avoid lifestyle change. The corporations that are most...
There are a number of powerful, wealthy venture capitalists. Bill Gates is the sort of prominent player here who's invested in a range of geoengineering. Exxon, BP, Shell starting to take an interest.
It is so cheap that the cost is basically not going to be an issue. That means that the side effects are harder to manage.
Obok, for example, is a prominent American climate scientist who points out the grave risks associated with attempting to tinker with the climate system of the Earth as a whole. Government, probably, backed by the military, probably, or in collaboration with their military, actually setting out to regulate the temperature of the Earth, which may suit their interests. It may help fix their climate, but if it's severely damaging the climate of another country, no wonder that the Pentagon has now got people, on the case. We supply for the operations of the US military, but of course the other part of it is the militarization of climate change itself, the geostrategic implications, the potential destabilization that it is likely to bring about, that the Pentagon is taking an interest in it. I mean, it would be derelict in its duty if it weren't taking an interest in the emerging science and geopolitics of geoengineering. There's virtually no regulation of geoengineering. There's virtually no regulation of geoengineering. Well, look, the system can solve the problem.
And so I think the question is, how do you draw the line between some activity that is allowed and doesn't need global governance and activities that do require global governance?
Dr. John Holdren has agreed to serve as Assistant to the President for Science and Technology and Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. I look forward to his wise counsel in the years ahead.
My personal opinion is that we have to keep geoengineering on the table. We have to look at it very carefully because we might get desperate enough to want to use it.
Aerosol geoengineering looks like it is so cheap that the cost is basically not going to be an issue. That means that implementation decisions will be risk-to-risk decisions. Nevertheless, there might be some good reasons to think about alumina. It turns out, first of all, there's been a lot of work on the environmental consequences of alumina in the stratosphere. The big deal really is that alumina has 4 times the volumetric rate of forcing for small particles as does sulfur. And that means you have 4 times less surface area for the same rate of forcing. And this is a much bigger deal. You have roughly 16 times less the coagulation rate. And that's the thing that really drives removal. So you could get away, we think, with much smaller mass fluxes.
Maybe I'm putting a particle into the atmosphere because I'm trying to make money, or maybe I'm putting a particle into the atmosphere because I'm engaging in scientific research and trying to understand cloud physics, or maybe I'm putting this particle into the atmosphere because I'm trying to make it rain locally to seed a cloud and get more snow on our ski slopes. And this obviously raises all kinds of questions. It's hugely risky. It will likely negatively impact some people, but we might find ourselves in a situation where those risks seem worth taking.
Numerous air quality studies, including from CARB, California Air Quality Resource Board, have named submicron-sized particulates as being particularly harmful for human respiration. Through all the discussions today, I have not heard any mention of this fallout, and has this been studied, and also the effects of a highly reactive metal like aluminum on toxifying soils and waters? If I could just clarify, so 10 megatons of aluminum dumped into the atmosphere would have no human health impact.
So let me be more careful here. Work to separate out the toxicological. So the alumina, we've only begun to research and publish nothing. We haven't done anything serious on alumina, and so there could be something terrible that we'll find tomorrow we haven't looked at. So I think that if we do more research, we're likely to find out that it's harder and more complicated than we thought, and that the side effects are harder to manage. And
bastante normal. En general requiere de condiciones un poco especiales. Se necesita que la humedad ambiental en las capas medias de la atmósfera, las capas altas de la troposfera, sea elevada, además que el viento no sea muy intenso. Entonces, cuando atraviesan los aviones toda esta zona, el mismo vapor que expulsan las turbinas pues favorece precisamente a la condensación de este vapor de agua y se forman todas estas nubes. Si además tenemos humedad en aumento, como mínimo constante, estas nubes no se disipan y además el viento, como decía, con dotes de características débil, tampoco favorece pues, a que se vayan deformando. Además, muchas veces cuando tenemos la formación de esas estelas de los aviones y vemos que se mantienen y que esos ciclos se extienden a lo largo del día, quiere decir que la humedad relativa incluso va en aumento y muchas veces nos anticipa un cambio de tiempo.
Vou mentir pra você, vou mentir pra você, vou mentir pra você.